Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Nader. In this video, we're going to go over a bunch of exercises together to get more practice with this switch statement in JavaScript. In the previous video, we went over a bunch of concepts for the switch statement and how it compares to if and else blocks. In this video, we're going to go over a bunch of exercises that are a bit more practical to get a bit more hands-on practice with how that actually works in practice. Let's get right into them. Okay, so I have a bunch of exercises here lined up. As with the other videos, I have a bunch of comments at the start of each of these exercises. I'm going to read through them, give you a couple of hints, and then give you a chance to try it yourself. And then I'll go through a possible solution with you just so you have a reference. Now for this first warm-up exercise, just to get our hands kind of warmed up, just so you can practice switch statements, let's see what we have to do. We have to create a variable called food that points to the string donut. Okay, and I realize that maybe there's many other spellings for donuts, but let's just go with this one to keep it short and simple. Then we want to create a series of if-else statements. I don't know why I wrote this twice, that basically do the following. First, we want to check for food being equal to fish, and console log sounds fishy. If it's true, we want to check for food being equal to hummus. Console log, I want some chips with that if true. And then check for food being equal to sushi, and console log with or without seaweed, if that's true. And if none of those statements are true, then we want to console log food is not in our database. Sorry, I just realized that this should be else, if, and then else. That's probably where my typo was. So an if, else block is what we want to actually do this so that we only execute one of these statements. Then we want to make sure this actually executes correctly. And then we want to change our food, maybe to one of these other cases like sushi, for example, to make sure it actually works. And then once you're done that, I want you to actually try to refactor or change your code to be a switch statement that we just learned. Okay, so effectively redo step 2 and then also step 3 to actually run the code to switch it up to a switch statement and make sure that the code executes the exact same way as the if, else, and else statements. So go ahead and try that, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so to start, I'm going to create a const food, and this is going to be a donut, making me hungry. We want to create a series of if, else statements. Okay, so if food is equal to fish, I have capital here, then what do we want to do? We want to console.log sounds fishy, right? And then if it's equal to hummus, we want to console log wants some chips with that. So we'll do an else if food is equal to hummus. And then I'll just copy this here. So we'll do a console.log, and then we want to do that. And if it's equal to sushi, food is equal to sushi. Sushi, spelling is hard. And then I want a console.log. What was it? With or without seaweed. Okay. And if none of these statements are true, we want to make sure that we log out food is not in our database. Sorry. So that's just going to be our else case where we're going to log out this line right here. Console.log. Just move this down a little bit. Food is not in our database. Sorry. Okay, so that handles kind of that whole chunk of code. We want to run our program and make sure it works, and then change food to be sushi instead of donuts to make sure it actually works as well. So I'm just going to pull up my terminal, make sure I'm in the right folder. I'm going to run a node warmup exercise, and then we get food is not in our database. Sorry, which makes sense, right? Because it's not fish, it's not hummus, it's not sushi. So then we hit the else clause. Okay. So let's try sushi, make sure it actually works as we intend, make sure it's got a capital if you actually mash it with a capital here. And if I run this, we're going to get with or without seaweed. Perfect. So that seems to work. Now we want to refactor this or change our code to kind of use this switch statement syntax. Okay, so I'm just going to comment this part out here, and I'm going to redo the exact same thing, but with a switch statement. So I'm going to change this back to donut to start, and we'll redo our steps here. So the way that switch works, as we saw, we have a switch, and then we have the thing we want to switch on, in this case, food. Then we have a block. And inside this block, we can have multiple cases. So we want to have the case where we're doing fish, and then inside of fish, we do a colon, and then we do a block of code. Now, these curly brackets I mentioned are technically not necessary, but I highly encourage you to actually use them. I'm just going to copy these console logs here, just so you don't have to watch me retype it. But most importantly, we're going to need a break statement so that we don't execute the following cases after this. So then we have the case where we have hummus And for hummus, we want to console log want some chips with that. Hopefully you can kind of see the pattern here. We have the case where we have sushi, which is our last one. And we're matching on these strings, which is what food is, which is how this exactly works, one primitive value at a time. And in the case of sushi, we're doing with or without seaweed. And in the case for else, we don't actually list out every other possible scenario because there's infinite of them. So we just have a default clause. And that works the same way, it just doesn't have an actual type after it, or sorry, an actual value after it, like sushi or hummus, for example, like we have with the cases. Default just kind of executes in all the other cases where it doesn't match any of the above ones. Okay, so in that one, we're going to have the not in our database console log. All right, just make sure this works the same way. If I run this code with donut, what I'll get is food is not in our database, so that's perfect. And if I change sushi to be our food, then we should get with or without seaweed. And as you can see, I actually forgot the break statements, which is a great example of how you should always make sure to include your break statements. Otherwise, you'll run into weird bugs like this, where it'll actually fall through. In the case of sushi, it actually fell through to the default case. And now if I run this with the breaks in there correctly, you'll have with or without seaweed by itself. Perfect. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's check out the first exercise together. All right, so switching things up here, we're going to work with an array of stuff. So to start, we want to create a variable called activities that points to this array of activities. So this array of strings. So we have swimming, hiking, rock climbing, biking, and running. Okay. Then what we want to do is we want to create a loop that loops over activities, and inside the loop, we want to use a switch statement that has these cases, okay? Now, I don't want to take too much time and do if else all the time, so if you want more practice, definitely try this with an if else, and then try it with a switch statement and kind of compare the differences, okay? So we want to check if it's swimming, print out like a fish, if it's rock climbing, like a mountain goat, running, like a cheetah. So we're only checking for these three cases, and in all other cases, we're going to say, I'm not sure, or I'm sure some animal does that. Okay. And then we want to run the code to make sure it actually works. So the tricky thing is we're mixing a loop here. You can use a regular kind of while loop or for loop, or you can kind of use a for of loop, which is probably what I'd recommend just to keep it nice and simple. Go ahead and try that yourself, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let's create our activities array first. So I'll say const activities, and this is, I'm just gonna copy this array right here. There we go. Now we wanna loop through this one at a time. So since we don't actually need the index, I'm gonna use a for of loop. I have a video on how this works with iterables like arrays if you have not seen this before. So I'm gonna say for const activity of activities, and inside of this loop, I actually want to run a switch block, right? So immediately I want to switch on the activity itself, singular, which is going to be each of these activities. Okay, so inside here, I'll do a switch, and I'm switching on the activity itself, the singular activity. And I have three cases, okay? You can see swimming, rock climbing, and running, and then a default case. So I'm going to run case swimming here. And the swimming case is going to console.log out like a fish. Okay. Then I have another case, which is going to be rock climbing. And make sure you match it exactly, right? So if we have spaces or if we have uppercase, lowercase, it has to match exactly because that's what the actual switch condition is checking for. So in here, we want to console.log like a mountain goat. And then inside of the case for running, we want to do like a cheetah. Okay. There we go. Now, what do we do in the case where it's not any of these three, right? So we saw that this is the default case. And inside the default case, we want to print out, I'm sure some animal does that. Now you probably noticed I made the same mistake as last time, which is I didn't include a break. So in this case, we would actually potentially match something and run all the other cases after it, right? So we want to make sure that we include a break after each of these cases, or inside the block at the end of the block for each of these cases, so that we don't run any other code. And best practice is just to include it for every block, including the default, even though since default is the last in this case, it won't actually do anything, but it's just best practice. Okay, so let's see what happens. What we want is we want to kind of loop through these one at a time. So first we're going to start with swimming. Okay, we're going to come in here, we're going to switch on swimming, and we want to see like a fish, right? Then that's it. We've matched, we have a bunch of breaks, so we don't run anything else. Then we're going to match on hiking, right? It's not going to match, so we're going to see default, which is the, I'm sure some animal does that. We're going to do that for all of these. So rock climbing is going to have this case, biking is going to be the default case, and then running is going to have its own case right here, which is like a cheetah. So let's see this in action. I'm going to run node and exercise 1, and look at that, right? Pretty cool. So we have like a fish, sure some animal does that, like a mountain goat, sure some animal does that, and then like a cheetah, right? So I'll leave it up to you whether you prefer the if else case for this. I think this is a pretty neat syntax. It's pretty clear what's happening here. We're looking for cases of swimming, rock climbing, and running. It's kind of very well laid out in the code, and your eye kind of naturally gravitates to these values very explicitly, as opposed to something like something equals something. It's a bit harder to kind of move your eyes around. This is, in my opinion, a bit easier to read, especially in the case where there's very explicit, very simple types like this. Okay, let's check out exercise 2. Okay, so for this one, similar thing, but we're going to work with an object. So we want to create a variable called enemies. Okay, pretend that this is a game, for example. And we're going to have enemies be this object. So we're going to have a rat property, which itself is going to be an object with a bunch of statistics, attack, defense, HP, and then a class. So the class is the one that we're going to be most interested in for this exercise. We're going to have goblin, troll, and giant, right? So rat and goblin have a class of 1, and troll and giant have a class of 2. Okay, so just keep that in mind. What we want to do then is we want to create a loop that loops over enemies, and inside the loop we want to use a switch statement, just like we did previously with the array, on the class property that has these cases. Okay, so we want to basically switch on the class. If it's 1, we want to print out this is an easy fight. If it's 2, we want to print out this will require some training. Otherwise, we want to print out not implemented yet. And we want to run our code to make sure that this actually works correctly. Okay, so now one hint I want to give you is you can't normally use a for of loop to loop over an object. You probably want to use something like object keys or object values or object entries to actually get this working, as we saw in the objects video together. So give that a shot yourself, and then we'll go through it together. All right, so let's create this object first. So we're going to say const enemies is equal to this object, and I'll just copy this. There we go. And then what we want to do, let me scroll down a bit, give myself some more room. I want to loop over enemies. Okay, so we're going to say for const enemy of enemies. So we can't really do this because enemies as a vanilla JavaScript object is not actually iterable. Okay, so we can actually grab keys, values, or the entries themselves using either object.keys, object.values, or object.entries. Okay, so in this case, since I'm not actually interested in rat, goblin, troll, or giant, like those names, I'm not interested in the key names. I'm actually just going to use object.values to pull out the value for each of the key names, right? So I can say for object.values of enemies. Okay, as you can imagine, object.values will give us back an array of the values inside of that object. So we're going to get back an array with this, an array with this one in it, this one in it, and this one in it. So it's an array of 4 items. Each is going to be an object. This one, this one, this one, and this one. So we're going to get one array back, and we're going to put that inside of enemy. Okay, so if I actually just log this out, just so you can see what I mean, it will make a little bit more sense. Enemy. There we go. Always hard to spell. So if I run node exercise 2, we're going to get back the actual enemy itself. Okay, cool. Now, what do I want to switch on? I want to switch on the enemy's class, right? And in this case, 2 possible values. In the future, we might extend this game, for example, to have many other values. So we want to switch on the enemy, but we want to switch on the enemy's class. So dot class. Okay, so this is kind of the trick here. We're going to pull out the enemy's class and switch on that. So this is going to be either 1 or 2 in this case. Okay, so in the case of 1, what we want to do is we want to print out this is an easy fight. So we're going to say console.log, and we're going to do this is an easy fight. In the case of 2, we want to print out this will require some training. And you can see I don't have my breaks in here yet, and I'll put that in a second. And in the default case, if we don't match 1 or 2, we want to print out not implemented yet. So for example, if we accidentally have a 3 or a 4, we don't want it to kind of not do anything. We want it maybe to notify us that is just maybe not implemented for sake of example. Okay, and we do need a break for each of these, so I'll just add that in there just so that we don't fall through, and then have the weird printouts where we match multiple cases. So in this case, we're saying grab each enemy, right? So grab each of these objects. We're not interested in the keys, rat, goblin, troll, and giant for now, just the actual objects themselves. And we're going to switch on the class. In this case, the class is a number, and it can only be 1 or 2 according to our object. Okay, we'll add another one, for example, and we can see what that might be if we have like 3. Okay. Now, if we run this code, let's see what we actually get. All right, so for in order, right? So we're doing first rat and goblin. We're getting this is an easy fight, which is correct because they're matching case 1. And for troll and giant, which are these 2, we're actually getting this will require some training because they're a class of 2. Okay, because we're running them in order. If we wanted to, we could probably do some extra console logging. If we did something like entries, we could pull out the actual name of the enemy and then the actual enemy itself, or the stats of the enemy. And we could say something like the rat will require is an easy fight, or the goblin is an easy fight, or the troll will require some extra training, right? So you can play around with it if you want to get more practice with template strings and object.values, keys, and entries. But this is a good example of how you might use a switch where we can actually take something in an object, for example, and switch on it, right? And just to show you that this will work, let's imagine we have a, like an ice giant, for example, right? Something like that, and it's a class of 3, right? If I run this code, what we'll see is that this is not implemented yet. Okay, and you can either do it with a snake case like this, and I usually prefer camel case like that for my property names, but it doesn't really matter for this example. You can see that at least we're getting the default case for something which doesn't actually match our classes. Okay, perfect. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's go to the third exercise. For this one, we want to create a variable called points that points at this array of numbers right here. So 3, 4, 1, 0, 1, 5, 6. Then we want to create a loop that loops over points. And inside the points, we want to use a switch statement that has these cases. So we want to capture 0 through 2 inclusive. Okay, so 0, 1, and 2. We want to print out good try in that case. We want to do the same thing for 3 to 5. So 3, 4, and 5 inclusive, we want to do very well done. And for all other cases, we want to print out, wow, shooting for the moon. Okay, and we only want to print out one of these for every single number. So for example, when we see a 3, we want to print out very well done. When we see a 4, same thing. 1, we want to print out good try. 6 at the end, we only want to print out, wow, shooting for the moon. All right. So give that a shot and do your best with this. You're going to need to make use of kind of the falling through feature for this. Technically, you can do this without falling through. So try it maybe both ways, and we can see probably a bit of an example together in a second. Okay, so let's go through this. I'll probably show you the fall through example and then kind of point out how you could do this with multiple cases as well, just for sake of example. So we'll say const points is equal to this array of points. Perfect. Now, keep in mind, we do need to kind of know the values beforehand when we're using kind of like a switch, right? To some degree at least. So we can't do like ranges very easily. If it's like hundreds of numbers, this works well for small, tiny ranges like this, and you'll see why in a second. So we want to switch on, actually in this case, I should get rid of the switch. I want to do a for loop first. So I'll do a for const point of points. So I want to loop through all the points, and inside of this, I want to switch on the actual individual point, right? Because I can't switch on the entire array at once. I need to switch on a single primitive value, in this case, each number one at a time. So I'm going to switch through 3 and then 4 and then 1, etc. So in the case of 0 through 2, let's see what we get. So I can do 0, and I could technically put my block of code here where I print out something like good try. Okay. So I could do this, and I could do the same thing, but for 1 and 2, right? So I could have a bunch of repeat code, right? So for example, if I took this and I kind of repeated it and I did like 1 and 2, that would be the same thing. That would kind of work fine. I would need a break in here technically, so I should have a break. But if I had a break in all of these, that would actually work correctly. Now, you're probably looking at this and you're like, oh, that's really gross. And I agree, right? And that's the point of a fall through. So what we can do in this case is we can say, well, all these do the same thing. So I'm actually going to kind of bunch them up like this with no breaks in between. And these are all going to match this block of code, which is then going to break. Okay. Now we can do the same thing for cases 3 to 5. So let me just write that out really quick. So I can say case 3, you can see case 4, and then I can say case 5. Okay. And in here, I can do a console.log. And inside here, we want to print out very well done. And we want to make sure to break. Okay. And finally, we wanted to print out wow shooting for the moon in the default case. So that is going to look like all of our other cases where we just have a console log here. I'll just put that in here, console.log. And then we want to do a break after this as well, just for good practice. Okay. So the way to read this is that this block of code right here, this line 21 and 22, is going to run in the case of either 0, 1, or 2. Okay, so if point is 0, 1, or 2, we're going to run this code. If point is 3, 4, or 5, we're going to run this code. And otherwise, we're going to run this code down here. Okay, if we got rid of the break, we would actually match, we would like execute very well done in the cases of 0, 1, and 2. So you got to make sure to have the break in there. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So I'm going to run node, and this is going to be exercise 3. So we get very well done, good try, good try, good try for these 3 lower values. And then we get very well done for a 5 again, and then wow shooting for the moon. Perfect. So imagine the case where we actually forget this break, right? I just want to show you that we will actually fall through in the cases of 0, 1, and 2 and print both good try and very well done, which is definitely not what we want and kind of leads to weird behavior. And in this case, definitely a bug, not what we want. So be careful with that. I always forget my breaks once in a while. So make sure that you kind of review your switch statements when you're using it and put these things in the correct order that you anticipate them to be in. Perfect. So I hope that was useful and a good series of exercises for you. If you found the video valuable, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I want to know in the comments kind of, do you use switch statements a lot? Do you find them useful? Did these exercises help? Do you want more exercises like this for practice or more practical exercises? I find that the more that you actually practice using switches, the easier it is to actually figure out kind of when to use an if statement or a switch. And as we kind of get further into our development together, what we'll see is a lot of really excellent cases where we can actually use switch, and cases where it just really, really cleans up our code and just it feels smoother and easier to read, much more like you'd be reading kind of like a bunch of English text, for example. Okay. So that said, what we're going to do in the next video, we're actually going to go over quite an interesting topic that's been added to the language quite recently. It's a bit more advanced, but it's going to open up a whole new series of behaviors and help us understand kind of a bit more of how a lot of this stuff works behind the scenes. And that topic is called generators, and the following topic after that is going to be using asynchronous generators. So I'm super excited to get to those topics. I'll see you over there.